If I were to ask you, what do you know about OD&D? Most of you would respond with, you don't know anything about OD&D, and that's understandable. Some of you might go, well, you know that it stands for Original Dungeons & Dragons, and that it's obviously the original version of Dungeons & Dragons. Some of you might say, well, it came out in like the 70s or something, and it was done by Gary Gygax. Some of you might even go, it's a very simplistic, outdated version of Dungeons & Dragons. That's fine, I understand that. Now, if I were to then ask you what it's like to play OD&D and what OD&D has to offer, none of you would be able to answer that, which again is understandable because none of you have actually played OD&D, and so therefore you don't know what OD&D has to offer. I want to change that. Now, I'm not here to sell you on OD&D, and I don't have a retro clone version of OD&D that I want to sell you. It's just that I love and still play OD&D, and it pisses me off how OD&D is considered the unwanted, forgotten stepchild of Dungeons & Dragons, and that the only videos I've even been able to find that even talk about OD&D are just videos that are retrospectives of one form or the other about the game, as if that'll somehow explain what it's like to play OD&D and what OD&D has to offer. That would be like me making a video going, hey, I'm going to explain what it's like to play 5th edition and what 5th edition has to offer by going, this is the year it was made, these are the people that, wrote up the rules, opening up the book, showing you all the pretty little pictures, going, here are some of the characters you can play, this is what it's like to create a character, and explaining how combat works. There. Now you know what it's like to play 5th edition and what 5th edition has to offer. Well, no, it doesn't work that way, does it? Well, it doesn't work that way when you make a retrospective about OD&D as well. And I always figured, well, what if somebody who loves OD&D and plays OD&D were to make a video explaining what it's like to actually play OD&D and what OD&D has to offer? Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would you even bother wanting to play OD&D anyway? It's an antiquated, outdated version of Dungeons & Dragons that nobody even plays anyway, especially considering 5th edition exists and everybody loves it and millions of people are playing it. One word. Gameplay. OD&D offers a way of playing Dungeons & Dragons that no other edition of Dungeons & Dragons has to offer. And I just think you deserve to know so that you could at least compare. For example, and it's going to be a little ridiculous, but bear with me. Let's say in 5th edition, they removed magic completely. No magic, no spellcasters, no spellcasting. In fact, the Wizards of the Coast from 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition removed magic entirely. So if you only played 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, you've never played magic in Dungeons & Dragons. But the older editions of D&D did incorporate magic. Well, if all you ever did was play 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, not only did you never play with magic as part of gameplay, you would have never known that magic was part of gameplay and how you're missing out on magic as part of gameplay unless somebody told you about the older editions in which magic was part of gameplay. Well, wouldn't you want to at least try an older edition just so that you can see what it's like with magic being incorporated in D&D? And that's what I want to do with these videos about OD&D, because there's no reason for you to even want to give OD&D a chance if you don't even know what OD&D has to offer in gameplay to even bother giving it a shot in the first place. Now, I doubt I'm going to be the best representative for OD&D, but I'm going to give it a shot. So bear with me. And I'm not going to be able to do it all in one video because God knows it'll probably take 5 hours, because God knows I can ramble that long about this topic. So I just want to kind of give like a primer, so to speak, to give you a little bit of a, I don't know, Reader's Digest condensed version, hopefully enough to at least pique your curiosity. Okay, you're with me? Okay, here goes. When it comes to OD&D, one of the aspects of OD&D is it changes how you approach playing Dungeons and Dragons. The example I usually give is OD&D is like a cup of coffee. And 5th edition, now I'm obviously going to be comparing it to 5th edition because 5th edition is, the edition most people play. And I'm going to try not to trash 5th edition in my comparisons. I can save that for videos another time. But anyway, so OD&D is like a cup of coffee, whereas 5th edition is like one of those fancy, complicated drink orders you get from Starbucks. The difference being OD&D, just like that cup of coffee, is just about the coffee. OD&D is just about D&D. Whereas 5th edition and all that fancy stuff that you can get in the drink order, it's not just about D&D, it's about D&D and all that extra stuff and all the extra fancy order stuff that you get in the drink. With OD&D, it strips out all that extra and is just about the D&D. And because of that, its approach to how you play is different. A good example is level gaining. Now, no, I don't mean about the fact that in OD&D you have to gain gold to get experience points, and in 5th edition it's not about that. It's not it. It's that in OD&D, gaining a level is something you have to fight for. It's something you have to work for. It's something you have to earn. Okay? You have to go out and you have to get X amount of gold, and you have to kill X amount of monsters to be able to get X amount of experience points to be able to gain a level. Whereas in 5th edition, and let's be honest, okay, this is not meant to trash, it's just simply meant to compare. In 5th edition, gaining a level isn't really something you try to earn. It's pretty much an expectation. Even the 5th edition rules pretty much establish that. And there's a lot of DMs that even incorporate that as part of gameplay. With 5th edition, all you have to do is play X amount of adventures and you gain a level. No matter how little or how much you do, no matter how little or how much combat or fighting it is, in 5th edition, gaining a level is an expectation, whereas in OD&D, it's not. You literally have to work and fight to be able to get the experience points necessary to gain a level. Another aspect of what it's like to play OD&D is the way I classify it. OD&D is player driven, whereas 5th edition and various other editions are DM driven. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, with 5th edition, when a group wants to get together, and this is for the most part, there's obviously exceptions, but when a group gets together for a 5th edition game, the DM has already set up and established what the adventure is for that gaming session or gaming sessions. Okay? So when the players show up, the DM doesn't really go, what do you want to do? It's, here's the adventure for today's gaming session or gaming sessions. Again, yes, there are exceptions, but for the most part, that's how a gaming session in 5th edition works. In OD&D, it doesn't work that way. In OD&D, the players establish what they want to do for that gaming session or gaming sessions. Now, yes, OD&D, the whole cliche of OD&D is all about the multi-level dungeon. Yes, I understand that. Except here's the thing. The players in an OD&D game, believe it or not, are not restricted to just playing the multi-level dungeon. I'll explain. Let's just take the multi-level dungeon at face value. Even though they're dealing with a multi-level dungeon, it's not that the players clear out one level, go down a level, clear out that level, go down a level, clear that level. It's not how it works. In OD&D, the DM can go, what do you guys want to do today? And the players can either go, well, you know what? We want to finish clearing out the 4th level of the dungeon. Or they can go, you know what? We found those stairs to the 7th level of the dungeon. In this gaming session, we're going to go explore the 7th level, see what happens. Or they can go, you know what? We never really figured out that puzzle room on the 3rd level. Even though we cleared it out, we never figured out that part. In today's gaming session, we're going to go check out and see if we can figure out that puzzle room on the 3rd level. So even though it's a multi-level dungeon, because it's a multi-level dungeon, the players get to choose where they want to go and how they want to explore it. But here's the thing. Like I said, in OD&D, you're actually not restricted to the multi-level dungeon. Because, as an example, as the players were exploring the multi-level dungeon, they ended up collecting, 3 or 4 treasure maps. Well, at the beginning of the game, or at the beginning of the session, instead of checking out, the multi-level dungeon, they go, instead, we want to check out these various treasure maps and see where they go. Today, we're going to check out treasure map 2 and see what, treasure, magic, and monsters are there. And treasure map 2 leads to an abandoned outpost with a couple of trolls and a evil magic user or whatever. Whereas in 5th edition, for that to happen, the DM would go, okay, I designed this abandoned outpost and it's got a bunch of trolls, an evil magic user, and whatever other monsters. And then the DM would go, okay, now I have to establish whatever hooks I can to involve the players into the adventure and to be able to do it. In OD&D, the players decide that they're going to go to the outpost, not that's the only option available for the gaming session. And not only that, because unlike in 5th edition, there has to be a resolution at the end of the adventure, in OD&D, the players could check out the abandoned outpost, go through 4 or 5 rooms and go, screw this, and leave. And go, you know what, we're going to go check out one of the other treasure maps and see where that leads. They're not obligated to finish whatever adventure in 5th edition is necessary. Players can walk away from they could check out, the 8th level of the dungeon, go into 3 rooms and go, we're not going to and encounter like 5 chimeras and go, screw this, we're going back to the 4th level. They could decide they want to check out the Darkwood Forest, and the DM would already have, set encounters, and one of them could be a bunch of wood elves, and the wood elves could inform the players about an evil druid, a hidden evil druid temple that's somewhere in the Darkwood Forest. Well, now the players go, well, now we have a choice. We can either go check out the multi-level dungeon, we can either go check out any of these treasure maps, see where they lead to, or hell, let's check out the Darkwood Forest and see about this hidden evil druid temple. And for the next few gaming sessions, they can check out the Darkwood Forest and explore the hidden druid temple. At the same time, they could go into 4 or 5 rooms of the hidden druid temple and go, screw this, we're not doing it, and then leave. They're not obligated to finish clearing out and dealing with the hidden evil druid temple. I use the example of Skyrim, like the CRPG, where when you're playing Skyrim, you can go on a mission, go halfway through the mission, and then stop, and then leave and regroup. Well, that's what you can do in od&D. The difference is, when you do that in od&D, there are repercussions for doing that. You don't just get to go halfway through, an abandoned outpost, right? And then leave, and then when you come back, it's the way you left it. Like, we'll use the hidden druid temple as an example. Let's say the players, run ramshot through the hidden temple, right? Get halfway through and then go, okay, we have to leave and regroup. Well, the next day, when they go back, it's not going to be the way they left it. Like, again, up to the DM. The DM can have it that the druids decide to retaliate and take it out on the wood elves because they were helping the players. So now the druids are decimating the wood elves, and the remaining wood elves leave the forest. Well, now the players have just lost the allies that they had in dealing with the druids. At the same time, the druids could be refortifying the temple, setting up traps, have it that now there's 3 times as many treants, that the players have to fight when they get to the temple. Oh, speaking of fighting, I have to touch on combat. Oh, you're going to love this. You're going to love this. Okay. In 5th edition, combat and encounters are an entirely different beast, pun intended, compared to od&D. Now, I can do a whole video just on this, so I just want to kind of gloss over it and just cover a few points. Otherwise, again, I don't want to make this video an hour. But, as an example, with 5th edition, the average amount of encounters are 6 or 7 medium to or hard encounters per day. Per day! In od&D, you get 6 or 7 medium or hard encounters per 50 square feet, right? And because there are such few encounters, it's because they're meant to have significance or purpose in regards to the overall story of the adventure. In od&D, that doesn't happen. You're literally monster. Like in od&D, when you do when you're dungeon crawling, you're pretty much monster hunting. The only overall goal is the treasure and the gold that they have so that you can get the experience for it. Right? Even random encounters. In 5th edition, even the random encounters, even though they're meant to, deplete resources and add a little bit of variety in case there's, traveling and stuff like that, even the random encounters are meant to have an overall purpose. In od&D, yes, random encounters actually do have a purpose. It's to stop players from wasting time. Because in od&D, you will spend time trying to find, secret doors, trying to find treasure, and the longer and to dissuade the players from spending so much time, wasting time trying to do that, for every turn or for every 2 turns, there's a 1 in 6 chance of a wandering monster. So that's meant to kind of dissuade loitering and wasting time trying to constantly find secret doors or hidden treasure or whatever. But that's like the purpose of random encounters in od&D is nowhere close to the purpose of random encounters in 5th edition. Then we have the idea about, there's actual videos for 5th edition for combat in 5e on how to speed up combat and how to make combat more interesting. That is not a problem in OD&D. Now, there's a reason for that, because even though in 5th edition and OD&D you can do tactical as well as theater of the mind, with 5th edition, because there are so many different types of actions and options available and penalties and bonuses that can be applied, it can slow down combat, even in theater of the mind type of combat. Because OD&D doesn't have all those possible different actions and options, it automatically speeds up combat. And here's a quick little thing. This isn't really an official way of playing out combat in OD&D. It's just that it's a type of playing out combat that I've been familiar with OD&D and 1st edition and basic. It's just probably an old school thing. It's a type of way of playing out combat that's a variation of theater of the mind that I've always known as abstract combat. And abstract combat is usually meant for, quick and easy resolution of easy combats. Like you do a random encounter and you encounter like 4 orcs, or you enter a room and it's just got 5 giant ants, or 2 skeletons, or whatever. And what abstract combat is, once the melee combat has been resolved and the 2 parties are engaged in melee combat, it's simply an exchange of combat between the 2 parties, where all of the party members can attack any of the creatures, and any of the creatures can attack any of the party members. It's just a quick and dirty way to resolve easy combat. And to add to that, and again, this isn't an official way to play OD&D, it's just such a common way of how I've known to be able to play combat in OD&D. You can switch from one way of playing out combat to another way of playing out combat in the same combat. So you could start off the combat playing it out as an abstract combat, and then halfway through it, you can switch to tactical. Not only that, because of the loose way of playing out combat in OD&D, you can actually have different types of combat being played out in the same combat. So you can have some of the player characters fighting a bunch of creatures in abstract combat, while at the same time in the same combat in the same room, you have the other bunch of player characters fighting their creatures, but they're playing it out theater of the mind or tactical. And you can play the combat turn per turn without disrupting the flow of combat of either type of combat. Now again, it's not an official way of playing OD&D, but because it's such a loose, free way of playing out combat, it allows for that ability or possibility. Speaking of encounters, here's another aspect about what it's like to play OD&D in regards to encounters. There's an actual official rule in OD&D about monster placement, and that is, with a dungeon level, as a DM, you set the type of creatures you want and where you want them and what kind of treasure they have. But to help the DM fill out the other rooms in the dungeon level, you roll a die 6, and each room has a 2 in 6 chance of having a creature in it, meaning on average about 35% of the rooms on a dungeon level have monsters. and not even all of them will even have treasure. And there's an actual gameplay mechanic to that, in that it allows the players the ability to, flee from combat. But there's also another side thing about it, and that is players end up itching for a fight, because after about 20 minutes of game time, literally kicking down doors and not finding anything, the player characters are ending up, they're itching for a fight. They're looking for something to kill. Okay? And it literally changes, because players end up going from being cautious and careful to like angry and looking for a fight. And of course, you also have other levels where it could be filled with as many monsters as you want. But it's one of those things that is distinctly od&D, much like how feats, whatever. I can talk about, I should probably stop the video, because I can talk about tricks and traps, mapping, character creation, races, all that, racial classes and all that stuff, but I'll probably save that for other videos talking about this. Anyway, those are a few of the examples of what it's like to play od&D and what od&D has to offer. Don't know how good a job I did in piquing your interest or whatever, but if you got this far, thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if I did a half decent job or if I sucked as much as I think I did. Anyway, I'm out of here. See ya.